we can go ahead. So trust in European democracies, the topic of our project. It's a pleasure to talk to everybody and to really think through some of the challenges and to think about what we want to know and what might be different about how we can approach this topic. So as Christian said earlier, we need to think about the theoretical framework, and that means some of the norms which have been very common, which we can challenge. We need to think about the research design and the data. And again, we have a large data collection project, the results, which I'm going to present just a snippet from the book, which I've just published in Praise of Skepticism, Trust But Verify, and then think about a 5-step research agenda that we can pursue in this next 3 years as part of this Horizons project. So this is just a little part of the conclusions from the book, which came out with Oxford University Press in the fall. Firstly, I think we've become rather complacent, and the assumption in the literature is that trust is always beneficial. And as Chris Velzel is going to argue in the next presentation, in fact, we need to be questioning this and think that sometimes trust can be a problem, especially where it's credulous. And we need to focus on trustworthiness rather than trust. Secondly, I think we need to say that from the point of view of the authorities, from those in government, from those who are in positions of power, trust and legitimacy are always valuable because they induce compliance. It means that people obey the law. It means that they go along with the decisions of those who are taking those laws or other decisions. But from the point of view of citizens, trust can be a danger, especially as we always tell people when we think about children, don't trust strangers. So there are many untrustworthy forces in the world. And if we trust those who are, for example, corrupt leaders, or those who lie to us, or those who make promises that they don't fulfill, this can be a problem. And we can make mistakes when we work out who we should trust, because we might think that we should trust people who don't actually act in the public good. And there's 2 forms of problems when we try to judge whether a politician, whether a party, whether a leader is going to be trustworthy. And the problems are partly there about cynical mistrust, and that's very familiar. That's when you trust, when the object of your trust is in fact performing well, but you don't trust them. An example which is known to everybody, something like the COVID vaccine, when many people felt that they could not trust that for themselves, for their children, and therefore there were problems for their communities. But the other problem is of credulous trust. And this is a problem particularly in countries without freedom of the press, freedom of expression, but even in countries like America, where there is widespread freedom of multiple different sources. If we only are in media bubbles, that could be a problem. And I'm going to argue that the problems of evaluating the trustworthiness of those in power comes from a lack of cognitive skills. In fact, we lack the information, the knowledge. Something like COVID, for example, is very complex. How can I judge the scientific evidence? But it also comes from countries and societal level phenomena, in particular, where we are thinking about open societies. There are multiple forms of information and watchdog organizations as well. But where we lack press freedom, that can be a problem. And what we need to do is less change the public, but change the trustworthiness of those in power, meaning their competency, their ability to deliver on their promises, and to have the ability to bring down, for example, inflation, or to improve jobs, or to improve people's lives, or to improve security. Their integrity, meaning their honesty. So we rule out corruption and other problems in politics, and their impartiality, so that they act in the public interest versus in their own interest. We need to have effective media watchdogs in order to do this. And I think this book leads to the next steps. And I'm going to suggest 5 steps that this project can do to take it further forward. This is a snapshot of the book, and I won't go through everything, but I will just give you a little bit about the theory and a little bit about the evidence and the conclusions. And this project is multidisciplinary, and that's invaluable because, of course, trust is multidisciplinary. And so different scholars come at it from different areas. If you're in sociology and social psychology, for example, you often focus on social or interpersonal trust. Behavioral economics does much the same when it talks about games, organizational studies when it talks about management. And that's important, for example, for the work of those like Bob Putnam. Political scientists in behaviour and comparative politics are more likely to talk about trust in national government and in civil society agencies. So it's trust in, for example, parties, trust in the media, trust in NGOs, and other agencies who intermediate between the state and citizens. And then also there's trust at the international level, for example, between countries. Think about the changes in trust towards Russia just in the last few years, changes in trust in global institutions like the United Nations or in the World Health Organization. That's the field of those in cultural sociology, comparative politics, but also IR, trust between countries. And when we think about the literature, we've got, as I mentioned earlier, 70 years worth of evidence and really excellent studies ever since the civic culture. And nearly all of these assume that trust is beneficial. Many of these studies have been done in democracies, in liberal democracies, and it's thought, for example, by Bob Putnam, that the more trust you have in your local community, the more you have societal cooperation, way of overcoming collective action problems. Those in psychology have argued it sustains relationships, for example, love and marriage. Francis Fukuyama argued that trust was essential for markets, particularly where you can't trust contracts or the state, but corporations can work with each other in trade. In the field of organizational studies, it's been argued that it helps managers to manage organizations, for example, to make sure that there's effective ways of getting feedback from those who are working in the organization. Of course, the classic of Gabriel Almond is trust strengthens political legitimacy, and that our ability and our feelings that those in government are the right authorities, underpins rule of law in legal studies, according to Tom Tyler. And of course, in America, the focus has been on things like Congress and the current polarization. And trust is seen as a way to get the parties and politicians to work together and to overcome gridlock. It can facilitate international peace, for example, Bruce Russett, and it can facilitate solidarity and cooperation. So if this is true, then signs of low and declining trust should be a matter of concern. And this is the view that is very much there in much of the media coverage. And of course, when we think about these issues, we often work backwards. So we look at events, and we look at the event of January the 6th and the insurrection in America against Congress, or we think about Bolsonaro and the events of the storming of the Brazilian capital, not just the legislature, the Congress, but also the Supreme Court, and the destabilization both of these events have caused, but also other protests in France, for example, in Bordeaux, or in Israel right now with Netanyahu over the justice reforms. And it's often thought that the more protests there is, this must indicate eroding political trust, but that's not necessarily the case. We need to look at that empirically. Similarly, when we look at leadership and we look at new parties, and we look in particular at authoritarian populists who have risen to power in many countries in Europe, again, this is often attributed to the erosion of political trust in either the mainstream parties, the Christian Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Socialists, the Conservatives, or it's to do with the lack of trust in the legislative process or the lack of trust in the judiciary to be independent. So again, these things are thought to be connected. But if we actually look at some of the patterns, and this is just a little snapshot of some of the evidence, which is from the World Values Survey, the European Values Survey over time. This is one snapshot which looks at public opinion in their confidence in government. It's a 4-point scale. And here what we have is those who are a great deal or quite a lot confident in their own government. And what you can immediately see is that, in fact, there's a complex pattern. It's not a simple decline. In a couple of countries, there is indeed a decline of confidence in the national government, in Bulgaria, in Slovenia, in Spain, perhaps, although again, there are ups and downs, a bit of trendless fluctuation. But if you look more broadly, has there been a decline? Not necessarily. In Switzerland, trust goes up. In some countries, it goes up and down, like in Hungary. In other countries, we see a pattern which is much more erratic, or in Russia, a fascinating country, we see, in fact, trust goes up under Putin. So it's far more complex than simply a decline across every European country, according to this evidence and according to the World Value Survey. What about social trust? After all, Bob Putnam argued, particularly in Italy and in the United States, that trust was secularly declining on a generational basis. But again, this is from the World Value Survey, and we now have 40 years of data, and we can see that in some countries, in Italy, yes, perhaps there is a decline, although it actually goes back to the status quo ante. In Bulgaria, there's a decline, but look at the other dramatic patterns. In Denmark, social trust has not just been high, but it goes up a lot. In Finland, it goes up. In Norway, it goes up. In the Netherlands, it goes up. In Iceland, it goes up. The Northern European countries, the Nordic countries, is a positive case. And in Germany, it goes up. So has there been a uniform decline in our social connectedness, in our ability to trust our neighbours, our friends, our colleagues? No, it has not. There's a much more nuanced picture when we look at this. What about trends in liberal democracy? Has this gone down? And again, we always cite Hungary. We started the last panel talking about the Hungarian case. It's an important case under Viktor Orban. And we can see consistently there's been a decline under his governance. Poland, another case next door, Law and Justice, absolutely, it goes down. Serbia, it goes down. But again, let's look more broadly, and we need to not just cherry pick our cases, we need to look across Europe. And here we can see in a divergent wide range of different countries, different regimes, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Northern Europe. In fact, many cases, the trends in liberal democracy, and this is the institutional trends from the Variety of Democracy Project, are flat. Or there's a bit of trendless ups and downs, but nothing which is a consistent decline. Moldova goes up and down, for example, it's very unstable. North Macedonia goes up and down. Kosovo goes up a bit and then up and down. Romania goes up and down. But again, in most cases, is there a crisis of liberal democracy across these countries? Well, you can certainly look at the last few years and you can say maybe, but maybe not. I think, again, this is something we need to investigate, not just take for granted. The same is true of turnout. And again, we're going to have a project on turnout. And I can give you some cases where it's gone down. Italy, we've talked about a bit. Greece, Ukraine. But again, in many countries, like in Belarus, we see up and downs. And in some countries, we see basically a flat picture. It depends on what period you take, what years you take, and things like that. So all of this is to be investigated rather than be taken for granted. And the relationship between trust and these other broader systemic patterns needs to be questioned. Now let's move on and say, what's the actual definition and understanding of what trust is and what's the origins of trust and trustworthiness? And I think there's three views in the literature, three schools of thought, three ways of thinking. Some in psychology, including Eric Olsener in his book, sees trust as an inherited characteristic. In other words, it's pretty fixed, it's pretty stable. It's like a personality trait. And so people can be trusting or not trusting, just like they can be optimistic or pessimistic, extrovert or introvert. Now, if that's the case, the trends over time should indeed be fairly stable, and we should certainly see big differences perhaps, but it can't be easily changed. And we have to look at the consequences of trust or mistrust. But thinking about, for example, the policy implications, well, it's very difficult to do anything about it on that basis. On the other hand, if it's societal, if it's about the values and the norms that you grow up in, it should be fairly stable and enduring, but basically based on your early childhood experiences and the main role models and the predominant norms and values within each society. And of course, this is the work very much of our late colleague Ron Inglehart and many others in that cultural tradition, who argue we see persistent differences between, for example, a Sweden of high trust and an Italy of low trust, a Russia of low trust, and perhaps Germany of high trust, but it shouldn't necessarily be able to be changed, particularly through policy interventions. Because after all, societal culture changes generationally and changes due to societal changes, not due to the way that we can intervene through laws or administrative decisions or other short-term interventions. Now, the third theory is the one I run within the book. And this is better at explaining fluctuations. And this says trustworthiness, not just trust, is about a relationship. It's about a relationship between principals and agents, a classic way of understanding these things. And it's an informal social contract. So a principal, which can be a citizen, an ordinary citizen, or it can be those who are authorizing another agent. We authorize an agent to act on the behalf of the principal. And so it could be, for example, hiring a lawyer to defend you, or going to a doctor if you need medical help, or trusting a party on their platform in terms of their policies. And the idea is that you expect them to act in the future based on how they've acted in the past. And the literature and organization studies says there's 3 criteria that people look for. Their competencies, in other words, are they actually able to provide? Are they skilled? Do they have the experience? Can they deliver what they promise? Their integrity, meaning their transparency and honesty, that they're going to act on the favor of their client, not their own, and their impartiality, which again means they're not simply there as party politicians, only giving benefits to their own supporters, which is clientelism, but in fact, they're going to act in favor of the public good. The laws aren't simply going to be simply to get votes or simply to line their own pockets, but to actually improve society. And these decisions about trustworthiness are particularly important under conditions of risk and uncertainty. It doesn't matter so much if it's trivial. If it's habitual trust, that might work in many situations. But if your life is at risk, you need a surgeon who's skilled. If your society has got major social problems, you need competent officials. And in those high-risk circumstances, our judgments need to be based on information, not just luck, not just on past performance, but based on good, solid knowledge about trustworthiness. Now, this leads us to a typology where we can think about our relationships, and we can think about this in a classic comparative politics sense. You can have trust by principles that can be negative or positive. You can be high or low in trust. But what matters is not just whether it's high or low. What matters is how it matches performance by the agent, which can be, again, positive and negative. So say you live in Sweden and the state is effective. There's generous welfare benefits. There's effective education policies. There's low levels of corruption. The ratings of democracy are high. Then, on an informed basis, you should be positive towards that agent. So in that sense, if you have information, you display skeptical trust. That's the ideal situation. But if you're in a country where the government is corrupt, where they lie, where they use propaganda, where they are promising things they can't deliver, or where they are providing very little information and very little public scrutiny, you should be skeptically mistrusting. If you're in Russia right now and you hear the propaganda about Ukraine, you shouldn't believe it. You should not believe that there are Nazis and it's a process of denazification, or that it's going to be an easy victory, despite the messages which are there on state television and despite the penalties for expressing mistrust of the government. Those are familiar positions. And both of those, I think, are normatively ideal situations. But you also get these other cases of cynical mistrust. That's where the government, for example, is trustworthy, or public agencies are honest, or certain social services are effective, but people don't trust them. And there are many cases of that, classically in Mediterranean Europe, but also in post-communist Europe. This is quite a common phenomenon, and also in Latin America and many other countries. And it can be cultural. Maybe the culture for many years, the government hasn't been effective. And yet when it gets reformed, it takes time to catch up. Public trust. And credulous trust is where the agent is, in fact, effective. For example, in America, where the elections, according to all the evidence, in the last couple of elections and further back, have had effectiveness in terms of no fraud, no explicit fraud, and yet a lot of people don't trust it. That's the case of cynicism, or they trust those who say that the elections were not fair, they weren't free, they weren't open, and therefore the media were fake, and so on. So credulous trust is where you trust a demagogue who provides information which is not accurate. Now, if that's the case, how do we get to judgments of trustworthiness? And here I'll just quickly say that we're trying to get at this idea of when is your judgment informed, when is it accurate or not, whether it's of your neighbours and your friends, whether it's of the state or whether it's international agencies. You want to think about performance. How effective is it? For example, levels of crime for the government. Have they been going down? Have they been going up? Inflation. Have governments been effective on that? In the Ukrainian situation, have they been effective in supporting European defence? Have they been competent? Have they had integrity and impartiality? And our public perceptions are what we're looking at when we're looking at survey data. And of course, there's no direct flow from performance to judgments. It all gets mediated through our individuals, our citizens. And that means their skills in working out in a complex media environment, their education, their knowledge, their interest, their media access and use, all of that will affect their public perceptions. In America, for example, if you watch Fox television, you'll get one perception. If you watch CNN, you'll get another. And the same is true in most media systems, particularly in social media. And then the societal information environment is important. Do you live in a situation where you have many sources of accurate information or not? Do you have media watchdogs to act as the intermediary? And other oversight mechanisms? For example, can the legislature hold the executive to account? And the legacy of cultural values provides a stamp on society which is difficult to change. And all of this has a feedback loop. Now, just briefly, the design. In my book, I just used the World Values and European Values surveys, which are pooled for 40 years, over 115 diverse societies. Some of them are closed, some of them are open. We have very good measures of trust ever since the beginning of 1981, 1983, the first wave. We've got excellent measures of institutional confidence. We have some measures of trust in global governance that have been added. And the TrustGov project, which was based for the book, funded the surveys in about 13 very diverse autocracies and added some new questions as well. Countries as diverse as Libya, as Morocco, as Myanmar, Nicaragua, Tajikistan, and so on. The World Values Survey, of course, is an ideal survey for this because we have such variations. This is the global coverage over the period. Nearly most parts of the world, pretty good in Central and Eastern Europe since the 1990s, not so good in Africa, but we're trying to get funding for that as well, pretty good in Latin America and so on. And these are the countries in the World Values Survey, some of which are open societies, highlighted in green according to the Variety of Democracy project, and which are highly democratic, cases like Denmark, the Netherlands, Greece, Slovakia, South Korea, not simply the established Western democracies, but some other countries as well, which are newer democracies. And then we have other countries which are highly authoritarian, very little information freedom, and low levels of liberal democracy, according to TRUEDEM, classically Belarus in Europe, Russia, as well as many other countries like Iran, Thailand, China, and so on. These are the measures in the World Value Survey of trust and confidence. Those are used more or less as the same thing. This is a factor analysis. I'm not going to cover them all, obviously. I'm just going to focus on the indicators of trust of national government as a scale. So that's things like parliaments, the governments, parties, and elections, and so on. And the way to work out whether judgments are accurate and informed, or whether they're otherwise biased, is to measure public trust in diverse societies and diverse agents, to measure performance, either subjectively, but ideally objectively, and then to compare the two. If the two are correlated, then I'm arguing that the judgments are ones which are informed. If they diverge, and public trust does not correlate with how the performance of that agency works, then I argue that it's either cynicism or it's credulity. Let's have a look at the results and then get on to the 5 steps briefly for our project. First, let me just show you some indicators of policy performance. Now, performance can be measured in many different ways of government, obviously. Here, what we've got are the standard developmental indicators, which were represented in the United Nations whenever we talk about measures of economics or social indicators. Basic things like economic growth, economic development, unemployment, inflation, income share for the highest 20%, which is an indicator of the inequality, or the lowest 20%, an indicator of equality. And then social indicators. What do we see? Well, we have a lot of open societies in the World Value Survey. If we look at the correlations between my measure of trust in government, which is a 100-point scale, including government, parties, parliaments, and the civil service, and indicators of positive performance, what we see is that there's often a correlation which is significant in about 25 to 43 societies, based on the 7th wave of the World Value Survey in this case, and the direction of the correlation points in the direction that you'd expect. To give a simple example, the higher the level of economic growth per capita GDP, the greater the public in those countries trust their government. The higher the level of economic development, the more trust. The higher the level of unemployment, the more negative the trust in government. The same is true of inflation, although that's not significant, I think partly because the measure of inflation was done at a time when inflation was low. The greater the inequality, the less trust in government. The greater the equality, the more trust. And this, I think, again, helps to explain, for example, those Nordic patterns that we saw earlier, some of the most egalitarian countries in the world, and which have high levels of trust. And the social indicators more or less work along similar lines. The more education, the more trust. The greater the homicide rate as an indicator of security, a very good indicator of a lack of trust. If your society and your streets are and there's high levels of crime, and there's existential risks to yourself and your family, then there's low trust in your government. Longevity doesn't work, maternal mortality doesn't work. Not every indicator points in the same direction for all sorts of reasons. There's noise in the data, the measurements are ineffective and so on, but nevertheless, the SDGs, the standard measures of development work. What about closed societies, the ones without an information freedom of expression or a free press? And there we have another 18 to 39 societies in the World Value Survey. And as you can see, in most cases, there's no significant relationship at all, except unemployment. The more there's high unemployment, the less the trust in government. But by and large, most of these indicators cannot explain trust in government in the closed societies. And I can just show you this just briefly as a visualization, and you can see the pattern. And the green line is the line for the countries which are open societies. And you can see that the vertical axis is per capita level of GDP. And quite simply, the higher the level of economic development, by and large, in open societies, the greater the confidence in government. The Switzerlands of the world, some of the most affluent, the Norways of the world, the Austrias, the Denmarks, the Swedens, the Canadas, the New Zealands, different parts of the world, North America as well as Asia, we can see a relationship. There's, however, the lower the level of economic development, the lower the level of trust, even in open societies like Mexico or Greece or Croatia or the Czech Republic, the less confidence. Again, there are some exceptions here. Hong Kong jumps out, Singapore jumps out, particular explanations for particular cases. Hong Kong being a residual, I think, before China exerted so much control. Singapore, because Singapore is an exception in nearly everything that we look at, a small island state. But broadly speaking, there's a pattern. If we look across the red societies, which are the ones which are closed societies in my definition, according to TRUEDEM, what we can see is that trust, for example, in China, trust in their government is expressed as higher in the World Value Survey than it is in Sweden or Switzerland. And it's not just isolated. The same is true in Myanmar, the same is true in Philippines, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Turkey. So in some of the societies which are highly authoritarian, which lack a free press, which have state televisions, their main sources of information, and state control through censorship of journalism and independent voices online, we see high levels of trust because there aren't forms of dissent. People only hear one-sided forms of information. But information across these societies, as we can see, there are many countries which are in similar situations of closed societies, according to TRUEDEM, but which have also low levels of trust. What about processes? And again, briefly, I'll just summarize this data. What we've got is forms of measures of the performance by good governance, not necessarily by policy outputs. So measures like control of corruption, government effectiveness, and so on, from the World Bank. measures also of liberal democracy from VDM. Whoops, in open societies, just to show you that pattern, there's a positive and strong correlation, which is even stronger than the policy outcomes. So the more trust, then the greater the control of corruption, the greater the government effectiveness, the greater the political stability, and so on. Now, clearly that's a reciprocal relationship. It's not all pointing from one to the other, and it's complex to disentangle. But the more that the government works well as a process, the greater the trust. And probably the more the trust, the better the government, depending on how one sees that relationship, which we can argue about. And the more democracy, the greater the trust. But look at the closed societies, and either the relationship is not significant or it's essentially negative. And it's particularly negative on liberal democracy. Again, let me just show you this. This is the pattern in our good governance index from the World Bank on the vertical index, and the levels of trust in government on the horizontal. And you can see that the relationship works. The better the quality of governments in the Nordic countries, in the Canada, the Austria, Iceland, etc., the more people trust their government. Now, there are some exceptions, and we can see there's some cynical mistrust where people are less trusting than you might expect. And that includes the United States, as well as France, as well as Spain, as well as Italy, and Romania, and Croatia, and some other countries. So it doesn't all fall in the same pattern, but nevertheless. And then if we look at the red patterns, again, we can see greater trust in government in Vietnam and China, one-party states, in Tajikistan, in Myanmar. This was taken, by the way, between the periods when the generals were in charge. We managed to do a survey then in the short-lived period of liberalization, although not necessarily full democracy. But we can see the pattern, and we can see the problems in Turkey and Bangladesh and so on. So it's even clearer when I look at liberal democracy. This is the Liberal Democracy Index. The more democratic the country, which in open societies, the greater the level of skeptical trust, and there's a nice relationship there. But in the closed societies, what we can see is that there's a negative relationship. The more autocratic, the more control that government has over its media, then the greater the trust they can engender, but it's not a clear positive relationship. So we need to challenge the normative assumptions. And again, Chris is going to talk about this. The idea that trust is always beneficial, not so. I think we've been too conventional in the past by focusing only on liberal democracies and a small group of liberal democracies at best. And we need to challenge that assumption. And of course, from the point of view of the authorities, they always worry when trust goes down, but it's not always a problem. And the problem of credulous citizens, those who believe the messages of those who are corrupt, or those who believe their government, and certainly say that they believe and trust the most authoritarian forces, is problematic. And often if we have a lack of cognitive skills, it's very difficult to judge complex questions, but also if we have no media watchdogs and other oversight mechanisms. So we need to build government trustworthiness versus changing the public. We need to build their competency, ability to deliver, their integrity and their impartiality, and we need to expand freedom of expression. Now, what does this mean for TRUEDEM and our project? And I think there are 5 different things in our research agenda, and this is part of our core mission. Firstly, as we're going to do, is collect new longitudinal and cross-national benchmark survey evidence in a wide range of countries. And of course, our project partners are from particular countries, but our evidence can be much broader. It can be across all of the member states, or across a wider range of democracies, or globally, if we want to do that as well. There's nothing to preclude it, but we might very much need to say, do we need new measures of trust? And can we trust our measures in closed societies? Secondly, we need to be able to compare objective performance indicators. As I've presented you, we've got some. But of course, if we only have a limited number of countries, then we quickly run out of N. If we're going to look at it as a public opinion compared with performance, and we only have a dozen countries, say, then we have a problem of lacking any reliable ability to compare across enough units. Now we can compare it across time, and we can also think about breaking down the unit of analysis. We don't need to think of it only in terms of the country. So one thing we can do in Europe is look at it at a NUTS level, for example, at regions. And we can compare performance, for example, in unemployment levels or levels of security, for example, police and crime statistics. Or we can compare any of the other sort of Euro statistics on things like health performance or performance of the economy on unemployment. So we need to break it down maybe by urban areas versus rural areas, or by different units, progressively fine-grained, and then use our public opinion data also at that appropriate level. That's an important thing that hasn't been tried in a really effective way, and I think we can start to do that in an interesting way with multi-level analysis. Thirdly, we need to break down the underlying conditions which strengthen not just trust, but accurate and reliable public evaluations of performance. And these are partly individual, I mentioned education, but they're also to do with the state. For example, how independent is the Parliament to have oversight scrutiny of the executive? How effective is it that there are anti-corruption measures? How effective is it that there are certain forms of group patterns which allow some form of societal changes? So we need to also here disentangle some patterns of causality by lagging some of our measures. For example, thinking through that there might be performance 5 years ago, which has an impact on public opinion today, and try to disentangle the causality in a circular process. Fourthly, we need to think about the impacts. And that again, I think is helpful when we think about the variations we observed earlier on in patterns of democracy, patterns of turnout, patterns of civic engagement, political behavior, and patterns of liberal democracy. And here what we're doing is we're treating trust judgments and informed judgments in terms of their consequences for the political culture. And then lastly, we come to the policy toolbox, and I think this is very challenging. And here what I would suggest is that we need to think about both changes to the public. How can we make the public more informed and knowledgeable and aware? We mentioned civic education in our earlier discussions, but also how can we make the agents perform better? So again, it's about how we can think through these relationships in complicated ways. And when we do this, I think the highlights in red are the parts which we need to unpack. So we need to know more at an individual level, for example, through experimental studies and through qualitative understandings about how our values shape our public evaluations and our accuracy of that. And we need more information about different types of media when we think about how we can break down the impact of your environment on your public evaluations. And then in the book, I never looked at the impacts of these judgments on culture, and especially I didn't look at it in terms of institutions. So I think there's a big agenda that we can try to work through, and I really look forward to collaborating with everybody and thinking through some of these issues as our project continues and as we work through some of these complex issues. Thank you very much. I hope that that was helpful, and I really look forward to your thoughts and ideas and suggestions. And Chris is going to pick up some of these themes, I hope, in his book, in his presentation on the positives and negatives of trust. Thank you very much.